Let's go back to the moment everything started to feel off, because this wasn't something that hit all at once. It crept in slowly, almost quietly, the kind of change you don't fully notice until it's already too late. Season 8 didn't open with a dramatic warning or a clear shift. On the surface, it looked like the same show people had been watching for years. Same format, same pacing, same familiar world. But if you were paying attention, really paying attention, there was something missing from the very beginning. And that something was not just a character, it was the center of the entire story. Charlie Hudson was never just the lead detective. He was the emotional core of Hudson and Rex. He was the bridge between the audience and every case, every moment, every quiet interaction that gave the show its heart. The way he connected with Rex, the way he carried himself through each investigation, the way he balanced seriousness with warmth, that wasn't something you could write into a script and hand over to someone else. That kind of presence is built over time. It's earned. And for 7 years, John Reardon built that connection with the audience piece by piece until it became inseparable from the show itself. So when season 8 arrived and Charlie Hudson was suddenly gone, it didn't just feel like a character exit. It felt like the foundation had been pulled out from underneath everything. And what made it worse wasn't just the absence, it was how that absence was handled. There was no real goodbye. No proper closure. No moment that allowed the audience to process what had happened. One minute he was part of the story, and the next, he was reduced to vague explanations that didn't match the weight of his importance. Missing, then dead, with no real journey shown in between. It wasn't just unsatisfying. It felt dismissive. And that feeling spread fast. Because fans weren't just watching a show anymore. They were trying to understand why something so central had been removed so suddenly, and why it felt like no one on the production side was willing to acknowledge how big of a loss it actually was. The introduction of a new character, a new detective stepping into a role that looked similar on paper, only made the contrast more obvious. Because the truth is, this was never about replacing a job title. It was about replacing a connection. And that is where everything started to fall apart. The show kept moving forward, as if nothing had really changed. The cases continued. The structure remained intact. But underneath it all, there was a growing disconnect that became harder and harder to ignore. Scenes that once felt grounded started to feel hollow. Interactions that once carried emotional weight now felt like they were missing something essential. And the audience noticed. Not all at once, not in a single moment, but gradually, episode by episode, until it became impossible to deny. Because when a show loses the one element that holds everything together, you can keep the format, you can keep the storylines, you can even keep the same setting, but it will never feel the same again. And that's exactly what happened here. Hudson and Rex didn't just change, it became something else entirely. And for a lot of viewers, that something else wasn't what they signed up for. And the deeper you look into what really happened behind that decision, the more complicated, and honestly, more frustrating, the story becomes. Because this wasn't just about storytelling. This was about choices. Choices that were made at a time when everything was already fragile. And those choices didn't just impact a character, they changed the future of the entire show. Now here's where the story stops being just disappointing, and starts becoming something much harder to ignore. Because what was happening on screen in season 8 was only one part of the picture. The real story, the one that explains why everything felt so off, was unfolding behind the scenes, quietly, while most viewers were still trying to make sense of the changes in front of them. Because Charlie Hudson didn't just disappear randomly. And John Reardon didn't just step away from a role he had carried for 7 years. There was a reason for his absence, and it changes everything once you understand it. During the later stages of his time on the show, John Reardon was dealing with something far more serious than a scheduling conflict or a creative shift. He was battling tonsil cancer. And not in silence, not in a way that distanced him from the people who supported him, but with a level of honesty that immediately stood out. When he finally shared his story publicly, it didn't feel like a press release or a carefully managed statement. It felt personal. Real. He spoke directly to the people who had followed his journey, who had watched him grow into Charlie Hudson, and who had unknowingly been watching him go through one of the hardest fights of his life at the same time. And when you go back and look at Season 8 with that knowledge, everything starts to make more sense. The reduced screen time. The quieter presence. The subtle shift in how his character was being used. At the time, it was easy to assume it was just a creative decision. But in reality, it was something much deeper. He was fighting for his health while still holding on to the role that meant so much to him. Now here's the part that makes this story hit differently. He didn't lose that fight. He didn't step away permanently because he couldn't continue. He went through treatment. He pushed through it. And he came out the other side. Healthy. Cleared. Ready to come back. Think about that for a second. After everything he went through, after months of uncertainty, recovery, and rebuilding his strength, he was prepared to return to the show that he had helped build from the ground up. The expectation, naturally, was that this would be a moment of return. A continuation. Maybe even a powerful new chapter for his character. But that's not what happened. Instead, while he was fighting to get back to normal, a completely different decision was being made behind closed doors. A decision that had nothing to do with his ability to perform, nothing to do with the audience, and nothing to do with the emotional weight of what his character meant to the show. The production chose to move forward, without him. Not temporarily. Not as a short break to give him time. But permanently. And the way that decision was handled only made it worse. There was no meaningful transition. No careful explanation. No effort to align the audience with what was happening. It was abrupt. Quiet. Almost as if they expected people to simply accept it and move on without asking too many questions. But fans don't work that way. Especially not when they've invested years into a character. And when John Reardon finally spoke about it, he didn't create drama. He didn't lash out. He didn't try to turn it into something bigger than it already was. He simply told the truth. He made it clear that leaving the show was not his choice. That this wasn't the ending he had hoped for. And that, despite everything, he was grateful to be healthy and ready for whatever came next. There was no bitterness in his words, but there was something else. Something you could feel between the lines. A sense of being pushed aside at a moment when he should have been welcomed back. And once that truth became clear, it changed the way people looked at everything that followed. Because now, this wasn't just a story about a character being written out. It was a story about timing. About decisions. And about how those decisions can reshape not just a show, but the way an entire audience connects to it. And from that point on, every episode of Season 8 carried that weight. Every scene, every storyline, every attempt to move forward without acknowledging what had been lost, it all started to feel different. Not just because Charlie Hudson was gone, but because of the way he was gone. And that's when the reaction from the audience started to shift. Slowly at first, and then all at once.